The boy was 7, his hand on the cold rock, reaching for the black mouth of a cavity his father's crew had just holed into. His father's hand came flat across his chest and stopped him. Coal dust gritted between his teeth. Water ticked from the roof stone in the dark. His father lifted a caged lamp on a cord, lowered it slow into the opening, and watched the flame before he let a man step inside. Warm air, his father told him, can carry death as easy as cold. 11 years later, he stands alone in a Yellowstone snowstorm, thrown off a freight wagon into the road, his feet already wet, the light failing, every shelter miles away. The wagon was already gone when Almond Vale understood that no one was coming back for him. He stood in the middle of the Mammoth to Norris road and watched the last gray shape of it thin into the snow. Sloan had thrown him off an hour past noon. It had happened fast. On the iced grade below Swan Lake Flat, the wheel team had stopped, blown and shaking, and Sloan had shoved the whip into Almond's hands and told him to open their hides. Almond had looked at the mules and looked at the ice under them and handed the whip back. That was all it took. Sloan called him useless, called him a thief, said a harness pin had gone missing at Mammoth, and now he knew who took it. Then he pitched Almond's coat and bedroll into the ruts, tore the wage chit in half so the 6 days owed could not be read whole, and drove on. Almond picked up the paper before he picked up the blanket. He stood there and counted what he had, because counting was the only thing left to do. One wool shirt on his back, trousers, boots already soaked through at the seams, a thin coat, a knife, a tin cup, 12 matches in a wax twist of paper, 2 biscuits gone hard as shale, 1 blanket with a burn hole the size of a fist, and 38 cents. That was the whole of it. No horse, no axe, no tent, no wood he could count on. Mammoth lay behind him, a hard day's walk in clear weather, and the weather was not clear. Norris was closer, somewhere ahead through the timber, but no one had told him a soul would be there when he arrived. The road ruts were already gone under the snow. He guessed less than 3 hours of light remained, and his feet were wet, and wet feet in that country killed men who had done nothing wrong except sit still. He could not simply walk out of the park. His wages were unpaid, and the railhead at Cinnabar was far past Mammoth, past the whole distance he could not cover, and there was no fare in 38 cents, and no family anywhere waiting to send him more. There was nothing behind him to walk toward. There was only the road, and the cold coming down it. He had been in the country 9 weeks. He had come west on the Northern Pacific with $1.40, and the notion that a strong back was worth something on the road, cruise, or in the mines. He was 18. He had been 8 when the roof came down on his father in a mine outside Connellsville, and 9 when his mother followed, and after that he had been a breaker boy first, bent over the coal chutes until his fingers bled, and then a lamp carrier, and then a timber helper, because timbering was what his father had done, and Almond had watched him do it before the world took him. He knew wood, and he knew the way air moved underground. He did not know this country at all. That was the thing that frightened him most. He knew how to read a mine, and he could not read a single foot of this bright, steaming, treacherous ground. At Cinnabar he had taken the only work offered, which was Sloan's. $1.25 a day and meals, hauling freight into the interior while the last of the season held. He had eaten better than he had in years. He had begun to believe he might winter through. Now he stood in the road and understood how quickly a man could be talked out of everything he had. He started walking toward Norris because standing still was surrender. The snow came harder. It stuck to his eyelashes, and he wiped it away, and it came again. Within a half-mile, the timber closed over the road, and the wind dropped to a mutter, and he told himself that was better. And then the timber opened again, and the wind found him, and he understood it was not better anywhere. he thought of the sergeant. 2 mornings before, at Camp Sheridan below Mammoth, a soldier had walked the freight line while it was still forming up. Sergeant Luther Baines, a squared-off man of 41, with a voice that did not rise because it did not need to. He had gone down the wagons counting, and he had stopped at the single storm tent lashed to the second wagon and looked at it a long moment and then looked at Sloane. "You are carrying commercial freight and one tent," Baines had said. "If the snow reaches your hubs, you turn back. I do not care what your contract says." Sloane had said the contract said otherwise. "Then the contract will bury you," Baines had said, and moved on. It was Allman who had spoken to him, which he regretted later, and needed later both. He had asked, quiet, whether there were cabins along the interior road, old ones, empty ones a man might use. Baines had looked at him the way an older man looks at a boy he already expects to bury. "There are holes in this ground that breathe warm," the sergeant said. "Freighters call them dead geysers and crawl in to get out of the wind. I have helped carry 2 of them out. A warm hole in Yellowstone is not a house, son. It is a grave with steam in it." Allman had not forgotten the words. Walking now, with the light failing and the snow filling the road, he turned them over and could not decide whether they were a warning or a description of where he was going to die. Because he was going to die, he could see that plainly. The math did not bend. A man with wet boots and one-holed blanket did not last a night in the open in that country, and there was no cabin, and there was no fire that would stay lit in that wind, and there was no one within shouting distance who would answer. He stopped walking. His hands had stopped hurting, which he knew was the worst sign of all. How, he thought, does anyone live through this? Then the wind shifted, and he smelled sulfur. He knew the smell. Any mine boy knew it. But under the sulfur was something else, something that made him lift his head against the sting of the snow. Warmth. Not much, a thread of it, carried on the wind from somewhere off the road to the south, where the timber thinned toward a pale open ground he had not noticed, because everything was pale now. He turned toward it. He knew what it was before he reached it, or thought he did. A thermal basin. He had passed a dozen of them on the freight runs, and Sloane had cursed everyone because the ground near them was rotten and the mules balked, and a wheel that broke through the crust could scald a leg to the bone. Warm ground was not safe ground. His father had taught him that a different way, in a different country, but the lesson held: warmth in the earth was never a gift by itself. It was always a question. What carried it? What came up with it? Whether the floor under your feet was floor at all. The snow near the basin lay thin, and in patches not at all, and the bare ground steamed faintly where it showed. Allman did not walk out onto it. He broke a dead lodgepole branch from the timber's edge, a good 4 feet of it, and he tested each step the way he tested a mine floor, pressing the pole ahead and putting his weight down only where the pole told him the ground was hard. It took him a long time to cross 40 feet. The mineral crust rang solid under the pole in most places and gave a soft, wrong, hollow note in others, and where it gave that note he went around. He followed a seam of bare warm ground toward a stain of orange and gray, and there, at the low edge of the basin where the land folded, he found the opening. It was not much, a slot in the crusted ground, maybe 2.5 feet across, sloping down into dark, rather than dropping straight. Warm, damp air came up out of it and touched his face and his frozen hands, and for one moment the relief of it nearly took his knees. He did not go in. He crouched at the lip with the pole across his knees, and he made himself think, because thinking was the only inheritance his father had left him worth anything. He remembered a day underground, himself no more than 7, reaching for the black mouth of a cavity his father's crew had just holed into. His father's hand had come across his chest, flat and hard, stopping him cold. Then his father had taken a lamp, a gauze-caged safety lamp, its flame small behind the wire, and lowered it slow into the opening on a cord, and watched the flame, and only then opened a canvas door to let the air move before he let any man step in. Warm air can carry death as easy as cold air, his father had said. You do not enter a hole because it is warm. You enter it because you have proved it will let you leave. Almond took out his matches. He had 12. He counted them again because a man counts what is precious. He struck one and held it at the very lip of the opening, his own head above the ground, and he watched the flame. It burned yellow and steady. It did not gutter. It did not flare or shrink or turn blue at the base. He knew what that meant, and more important, he knew what it did not mean. A steady flame told him there was breathable air right there at the mouth. It told him nothing about 8 feet down. The sulfur smell was faint here, but the earth had many bad airs, and some of them a flame would show, and some it would not, and some a man could not smell at all once they had begun to kill him. His father had said that too, and the men who taught his father had learned it the hard way and buried the ones who had not. The match went out. The wind rose behind him, colder than before, and threw snow down his collar. 2 things were true, and both were trying to kill him. Above, certain death tonight from the cold. Below, a chance, only a chance, that the warmth was survivable, and under that chance, the older, darker chance that the air would put him to sleep and never wake him. He could not stay at the lip forever deciding. The deciding itself was costing him warmth he did not have. Almond knotted the burned blanket around his waist. He turned so his boots went first, and with his head still up in the free air, breathing the cold on purpose one last time, he began to lower himself into the ground that everyone he had met agreed was a grave. He tied one end of the blanket to a lodgepole root that had grown down into the crust, and he went down along the slope on his hands and heels, keeping his face turned up toward the light of the opening for as long as the passage led him. 8 feet, he judged, before the slope eased and he could crouch. The stone closed around him on 3 sides. The air here was warmer than bath water left standing and damp, and it moved. He felt it move. A slow breath drawn past his cheek toward the back, and then higher, pushed forward again toward the mouth. Moving air. His father would have called that half of living. He stayed low and still, and let his eyes make what they could of the dark. The cavity was small. He measured it later, but even then his hands told him the shape. Perhaps 8 feet deep, 5 across at the widest, a man's crouched height at the center. The rear wall, when he reached it with his palm, was warm, warmer than the front, warm enough that he pulled his hand back, but it was dry warmth, radiant, not the wet scald of live steam. There was no pool. There was no hiss of boiling. Water gathered on the low ceiling and ran in a thin thread toward a crack in the floor and drained away. The sulfur was stronger here, but not choking, and the flame of his second match burned true even at the center. He did not go to the warm rear wall, though every cold inch of him wanted to. He chose instead a narrow shelf of stone near the entrance, in the cooler air, where he could feel the outside cold reaching down, and where if the deep air went bad, he was already halfway out. It cost him warmth to sit there. He knew it, and he did it anyway, because his father had lowered a lamp before he opened a door, and a man who trusted warmth simply because it was warmth was a man who did not understand what he was trusting. He laid one biscuit at the rear wall and one at the entrance, a thing he could not have said why he did, except that a mine boy learns to leave himself a way to measure the unmeasurable. Then he wrapped the blanket close, and he shivered, and he waited to find out whether the ground would let him see morning. The night did not go easy. Twice the snow slid across the opening and cut the free air down to a slot, and both times Almond dragged himself up the slope and cleared it with his arm, and lay panting in the cold with his head out in the storm until his breath came back. Condensation gathered on the low ceiling and dripped, and one drip found the back of his neck and ran down his spine, and he could not move far enough to escape it. He felt his matches in their waxed twist inside his shirt, going soft with the damp. He pressed them higher, into his armpit, and prayed they would hold. Once, near the worst of the dark, the rock made a sound. It came up through the stone under him more than through the air, a low rumble, long, felt in the teeth, and with it the sulfur smell thickened, sudden and sharp, until his eyes watered and a dullness pressed behind his forehead. He did not tell himself it would pass. He hauled himself up the slope, opened the entrance as wide as his arms could clear it, and put his whole head and chest out into the falling snow, into the killing cold, and he stayed there breathing it until the ache behind his eyes let go, and the smell below faded back to its faint, ordinary bad. Only then did he ease down again, lower this time, closer to the mouth, and only halfway trusting even that. He thought, lying there, the sergeant was not wrong. It could take me yet. And then he thought, in his father's voice, then do not give it the chance. Watch it. Do not sleep as if it loved you. He did not sleep as if it loved him. He slept the way a man sleeps beside a dog that has bitten before, a hand's width of sleep at a time, waking to smell the air, to feel the wall, to check the light at the mouth. When the light at the mouth turned from black to gray, he was still alive. Almond crawled up into a changed world. The storm had eased in the night. Nearly a foot of new snow lay in the sheltered places, and far more against the trees, and the basin steamed in the cold dawn as though the ground itself were exhaling. He was soaked and wrung out, and his hands were split at the knuckles. But he stood in the gray light on his own 2 feet, and that was more than he had believed he would do. He reached back down and brought up his tin cup, which he had left near the entrance with an inch of water in it. Outside, that water would have frozen solid. He tilted the cup. The water moved, liquid, warmer than the air. He pulled out the 2 biscuits. The one from the entrance was frozen through, hard as the road. The one from the rear wall bent when he pressed it, still chewable. He stood a while holding both, the frozen and the soft, understanding what they meant and understanding, too, that it meant nothing to anyone but him. He had a proof no one had seen. He had survived a night that should have killed him, in a hole a soldier had called a grave, and there was not a living witness to any of it. He was wrong about the witness. He learned it within the hour. He was still standing at the basin's edge, working, feeling back into his hands, when he heard the crunch of hooves on crust and a man's voice calling out across the snow. An army patrol, 2 riders, come out from the direction of Mammoth to break trail after the storm, and behind them, riding in a Camp Sheridan wagon with a driver, a young woman in a gray wool coat too big for her, her chin down against the cold. They had found his footprints where he crossed the road. They followed them to the basin's edge and stopped, and the woman stood up in the wagon before it had finished stopping. She was perhaps 19. She looked at him, and then she looked at the hole in the ground behind him, and then back at him, and Almond saw that she knew him. "You came off Sloane's wagon," she said, "below the flat. He threw your coat in the road." "Yes," Almond said. "I was in the wagon behind." Her name, he would learn, was Mina Cottrell, and she worked in the Camp Sheridan kitchen, and she had watched the whole thing happen from 100 feet back and been carried around the bend before she could so much as open her mouth. She had told the sergeant. That was why the patrol had come this far south, not for a hole in the ground, but for a body they expected to find in the road. Instead, they found a boy standing in a steaming basin, alive. Mina climbed down from the wagon. One of the soldiers told her to stay back from the crust, and she ignored him and came to the edge of the safe ground and stopped there. And she looked Alman over from his split hands to his soaked boots, and her eyes went hard and knowing in a way that told him she had grown up somewhere cold, too. "You spent the night in that," she said. It was not a question. "I did." "Then look at yourself." She pointed at his cuffs, at the dark, wet wool clinging to his wrists, at the water standing in the creases of his coat. "That place did not freeze you. It soaked you. Every thread you own is wet through. Give it another night, and your own coat will finish the work the cold started. You will not feel it happen. That is how it kills." Alman had no argument, because she was right, and he knew it in the same part of him that had refused the warm wall in the dark. The warmth had solved one thing and made three more. He had thought it in the night, and here it was, said out loud by a stranger who had needed one look. He did not tell her the cavity was safe. He knew better than to say that word about that ground. He held out the two biscuits instead, the frozen and the soft. Then he held out the tin cup with its unfrozen water. "That," he said, "spent the night by the wall, this one by the door." He turned the frozen biscuit in his fingers. The door froze. The wall did not. The water did not. He looked at her. "I am not telling you it is safe. I am telling you it can be made to work if a man is careful about what makes it dangerous. The wet is one of those things. You are right about the wet. I do not have an answer for the wet yet." Mina looked at the biscuits a long moment. She did not soften exactly, but something in her face shifted from a woman looking at a corpse to a woman looking at a problem, and Alman would learn that with Mina Cottrell, those were nearly the same as respect. "No," she said at last, "you do not have an answer for the wet, and there is worse than the wet down there, or that basin would be full of freighters every winter instead of graves." She stepped back from the crust. "Get in the wagon before you prove me right standing here." Behind her, one of the soldiers had dismounted and was staring down into the dark mouth of the opening with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to report something. The warmth breathing up out of the ground, the single set of prints going down and coming back up, and the question none of them could yet answer sitting in the cold between them all, whether what Alman had found was a shelter or only a slower grave than the one the road would have given him. They took him to Mammoth. They did not let him keep the hole. Camp Sheridan sat below the Mammoth terraces, a scatter of frame buildings and tents the Army had thrown up when it took over the park's keeping that August, soldiers where before there had only been a few civilians and a great deal of country no one governed. Alman was given a meal, the first hot food in a day and a half, and he ate it too fast and was ashamed, and a place to sleep in the stable straw, and word that after one night he would need to find work or start walking back toward Cinnabar. The park, he was told, belonged to the government. Surviving a night in it gave a man no more claim to it than a bird had to the sky it flew through. He would have taken the meal and the straw and been grateful and gone if Sloane had not come back. The freight wagons rolled into Mammoth the next afternoon, having turned back from the interior at last, and Elbert Sloane climbed down stiff and cold and furious, and the first thing he did upon learning the boy he had thrown in the road was sitting alive in the stable was to start building the story he needed. He built it loud, in the open, where the camp could hear. Alman had deserted, Sloane said, walked off the job on the grade and left the convoy a man short in the worst of it. A harness pin had gone missing, And now the thief was found, and a coil of good wagon rope was gone too. And where would a stranded boy get rope if not by stealing it? And as for the warm hole the patrol was buzzing about, if there was any government bounty in reporting such a thing, it belonged to the freight company that had brought the boy into the country, not to the boy himself. He said all of it, and then he saw Almond standing in the stable door, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks he has already won. "There he is," Sloane said. "A boy too soft to lay a whip on a mule, and now they tell me he found a warm crack in the ground and crawled into it, and half this camp is calling him clever for it." He turned so the soldiers near the mess could hear him. "A boy frightened of a whip found a warm crack, and now he calls himself an engineer." A few men laughed. Not all, but enough. Almond felt the old heat come up his neck, the shame that had followed him since the day he was 7, and did not stop his father from going into a working his father did not like the look of. He knew where that shame led. He made himself go the other way. He did not raise his voice. He reached into his shirt and brought out the torn wage chit, gone stiff now with dried mud, and he held it up. 6 days, Almond said. "Your hand wrote it. You tore it so the figure would not read. A deserter does not carry the pay he is owed. He runs from it." Sloane's smile tightened. "And the rope," Almond said. And here Mina, who had come to the mess door drawn by the noise, spoke up before he could finish. "He came off your wagon with a blanket and a bedroll and nothing else," she said, clear across the yard. "I watched you throw them. There was no rope. There was no rope because I saw his hands were empty except for what you pitched in the road after him." And then Almond added the last of it because he had thought about it in the straw the night before, knowing this fight was coming. "If I stole your company rope, it would carry your company mark. Cut it and look. The only rope I have ever spliced is my own, and I splice it the way my father spliced it, with a short berry and a whipped end. Your teamsters do it long and lazy. Cut any rope you claim as mine and see whose hand made it." Sloane did not send for any rope to cut. That told the yard enough. But the sergeant, watching from the edge of it all, was not moved the way the crowd was moved. Baines came forward when the noise died, and he did not look at Sloane, and he did not congratulate Almond. He looked at the boy the same tired way he had looked at him 2 mornings before the storm. "You won that?" Baines said quietly. "It changes nothing I care about. You want to go back to that basin. I can see it on you. And I am telling you the same as before, that ground is not yours and it is not safe, and I have carried men out of holes just like it, blue and cold and dead with no mark on them, poisoned by air that smelled like nothing at all." He shook his head. "I will not let an untrained boy go dig at a thing in this park that the army is charged to protect, and that could kill the next fool who follows his footprints in." Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who could not yet see what you were building? It was that last part that gave Almond his opening, and he took it because it was true and because it was the only argument the sergeant might hear. "Then that is exactly why it should be studied," Almond said. "Not for me. Freight crews already know it is there. They already crawl into it out of the wind. You told me so yourself. You said you have carried 2 of them out, which means the next one is coming whether you like it or not, and he will go in the way I nearly did, with no lamp and no test, and no notion that the warm air is the danger. If the army marks it, tests it, learns what it does, and when it goes bad, that man might live. If you leave it a nameless hole with warmth breathing out of it, you're leaving a baited trap on your own road." Baines was quiet a long moment. The camp had gone quiet with him. Even Sloane said nothing, though his jaw worked because he could see the sergeant weighing it, and he did not like which way the scale was tipping. "You talk like you know something about bad air," Baines said finally. "My father was a timberman," Almond said. "I carried the lamp before I could carry a beam. I know that warm and safe are two different words, and most men who die underground die because they forgot it. He paused. I would rather be the man who marks the trap than the man you carry out of it. Baines did not smile, but he stopped saying no. What he said instead came slow and hedged and hard, and Allman understood even as he heard it that he had not won anything so much as been handed a longer rope to hang himself with. The boy could go back to the basin, Baines said, but not alone and not free. He would go only with an army road foreman, a man qualified to judge the ground. Nothing was to be broken from the mineral crust. No claim would be recognized, no dwelling, no ownership of any kind. The site would be looked at as one thing only, a possible emergency refuge for the road, for the army, for no man's profit. And it would end all of it, the moment it began, if the air proved foul, or the rock proved rotten, or the water proved treacherous. One bad sign, and the hole would be closed, and Allman would be sent to Cinnabar, and that would be the end of him in the park forever. Those are the terms, Baines said. Take them, or take the road south. I take them, Allman said before the sergeant could reconsider. By then the mockery had already begun to stick to him. He heard it that night in the mess and the days after, the names the camp made for a boy who had crawled into a grave and come back talking about ventilation, geyser mole, steam boy. The corpse who walked back. Sloane fed every one of them, and men who did not know Allman repeated them because a name is easier than a thought. Mina did not use the names, but she did not defend the plan either. When Allman asked her plainly whether she thought it could work, she looked at his wet cuffs, still not fully dry 2 days on, and she gave him nothing. Fix the water, she said. Fix the air, then ask me. The foreman came 3 days later. Allman was told only a little about him before he arrived, and none of it was comforting. He had spent most of his life underground. He had worked mines in 2 states and road cuts in more. He walked with a bad knee and carried a caged lamp of his own, and this was the part that sat in Allman's stomach like a stone. His particular reputation, the reason the army trusted him with a thing like this, was that he closed unsafe workings. That was his gift. He was the man they sent when they needed someone to look at a hole in the ground and decide coldly whether it should be saved or sealed. He had sealed far more than he had saved. The morning he was due, Allman walked out early to the edge of the camp and looked south, toward the interior, toward the basin steaming somewhere out past the timber under a hard blue winter sky. 12 days, they said, before the season closed the interior road for good and the last freight stopped moving. 12 days to prove that a grave could be made into a shelter, to a man whose whole trade was proving the opposite. He heard the foreman before he saw him, the uneven step of a stiff-kneed man on frozen ground coming up the road behind him. Allman turned to meet the one person who could give him everything or take the last of it away. The foreman was a big man gone lean, with gray and a week's beard, and a right knee that would not fully straighten, so that he came up the road with a roll and a hitch, one boot dragging a shallow line in the snow behind him. He carried a canvas satchel and a caged lamp and a folding rule sticking out of his coat, and he stopped 6 feet from Allman and looked at him for a long time without a word of greeting. "Merritt Gage," he said at last, "they tell me you are the boy who wants to make a bedroom out of a fumarole." "I want to make a refuge," Allman said, "and I do not think it is a fumarole. There is no live steam. The rock is warm but dry." Gage grunted. It was not agreement. "Sit down, not you," he said when Allman started to lower himself onto a stump. "The story. Sit it down in front of me. Everything you touched, everything you smelled, everything that made a sound. And do not leave out the parts that make you look like a fool. because those are the only parts I trust. So Alman told it. He told the descent and the warm wall and the water running to the crack and the sulfur. He told the match at the lip and what it proved and what it did not. He told the rumble in the night and the smell that thickened with it, and how he had climbed out and put his head in the storm until it passed. He told the 2 biscuits and the unfrozen cup, and he told the thing he had told no one, because he sensed this man would hear it as it was meant. He told Gage that he had not slept at the warm rear wall, though every cold inch of him had begged to. He had slept near the cold mouth, where the outside air still reached, because a warm pocket he could not see the bottom of was a thing he did not trust, and a man who could not see out was a man who could not get out. Gage had been leaning on his stiff leg, half turned, listening the way a man listens who has already decided the answer. When Alman said that, he turned the rest of the way around. Say that again. I slept by the cold. I gave up the heat because I could not prove the heat was safe. For the first time, the foreman's face changed. It did not soften into kindness. It hardened into a kind of attention. A fool finds heat and crawls toward it, Gage said. A miner asks what carried it there. He looked out at the timber toward the interior. Every man I ever pulled out of a warm hole died crawling toward the warm, toward the back, toward the deep pocket where it felt best. That is where the bad air pools, boy, at the bottom where a cold man most wants to be. He picked up his satchel. You slept by the door. All right, I came out here to close a grave. I will look at your refuge instead. But understand me. I have sealed 40 holes for everyone I have saved, and I will seal this one and put you on the southbound road without losing a night's sleep, if it lies to me even once. That is all I want, Alman said. A man who will close it if it lies. Gage almost smiled. He did not quite. Then we may get along. They went out to the basin the next morning with an army wagon of lodgepole timber, rope, canvas, and tools, and before Alman was permitted to lift a single thing, Gage taught him to read the ground. He handed him a sounding rod, a slim iron bar with a blunt head, and made him probe every foot ahead before he set it down, and taught him to hear the difference between the ring of solid rock, the dull, brittle knock of mineral shell over a void. That sound, Gage said, striking a patch that answered hollow, is a lid. You do not know what the pot underneath holds. Steam, boiling water, nothing at all. You will not find out by standing on it. He drove a red-flagged stake at the edge of it. You mark it, and you go around it, and you never believe that because it held you yesterday, it will hold you today. Warm ground moves. It is alive in a way stone is not. They marked a safe path to the mouth with stakes, and they marked the hollow places, and one of the hollow places was inside the cavity itself, a stretch of the floor near the warm rear wall that knocked dull under the rod. There, Alman said. That is the warmest ground. I thought to build the platform there. Then you would have built your bed on a lid, Gage said. No, the platform goes forward, in the cooler air, on stone that rings true. You will be colder. You will be alive. Those are not the same as comfortable, and you would do well to stop expecting them to be. That was the first lesson. The second was the one that mattered most, and Gage gave it with his caged lamp lit and hanging in the cavity mouth. This flame will show you some bad airs and hide others, he said. It burns low when the good air runs thin. It will not warn you at all of certain poisons that a man cannot smell once they have taken hold. So you will not trust the flame the way a fool trusts a warm wall. You will build the safety into the walls themselves. He held up 2 fingers. 2 openings. Always 2. Never 1. Never 3 that you cannot control. Never a door you can shut all the way. Low on the windward side of the entrance, they framed an intake gap no more than 4 inches high, angled so the wind would not drive straight into it. High on the leeward side, they built an exhaust, a timber box 6 inches square that rose several feet above where the snow was expected to lie, capped with a simple wooden cowl that turned in the wind to keep the snow out and the draft drawing. Both passages could be cleared from inside with rods. Neither could be closed all the way, not even by mistake, not even by a man half dead and confused. "Say the rule back to me," Gage said when it was framed. Almond said it. "If I cannot keep 2 breaths open, I do not stay for one." Again. He said it again. He would say it 100 times in the days that followed, until it was not a rule but a reflex, until he heard it in his own father's voice. The third fight was against the water, and it was Mina who won it. She came out with the second timber wagon, sent by the camp to cook for the work party, and within an hour of arriving she had walked the cavity, put her hand to the dripping ceiling, looked at the pooling on the floor, and pronounced the whole thing a scheme to drown a man slower than the cold would. "You cannot sleep in this," she told Alman. "It rains in here. It rains up out of the ceiling all night. Whatever you lie on will be soaked by morning, and then you are worse off than the road." "Which is why we are building this," Gage said, and showed her the sleeping deck, split lodgepole slats on a frame, 18 inches above the drainage floor, so no bedding ever touched the wet stone, with a shallow trench to carry the runoff toward the natural crack. Above it, they meant to hang a canvas fly to catch the ceiling drip. Mina looked at the fly they had rigged and shook her head. "That pitch is too shallow. It will pool in the middle and then dump the whole load on whoever sleeps under it. And you have tied it so it cannot come down, which means it cannot dry, which means it will rot and stink and grow heavy." She took the canvas down before either man could argue. She rehung it with a steeper pitch and removable ties, so it shed the drip to one side and could be pulled down and dried in the open on a clear day. "There," she said. "Now it is a roof and not a trap." Alman had asked her to judge the canvas rather than merely sew it, and she had judged it and improved it, and from that hour she was not a woman helping at the edges of the work. She was in it. The fourth lesson was the shortest, and the one Alman liked least. Gage forbade any fire inside the cavity. No stove, no campfire, no coals. "But the heat," Alman began. "The heat comes from the ground for free, and it will not eat your air," Gage said. "A fire will. A fire in a hole with 2 small vents is a slow rope around every neck inside. You will warm this place with the rock, with your own bodies out of the wind, with dry clothes and snow banked round the outside hood, and with nothing that burns. If you are ever tempted to light a flame in here for warmth, you go outside and you sit in the cold until the temptation passes." Every man I carried out believed a small fire could not hurt in such a big country. The country is big. The whole is not. So they built. And the building took the toll that building takes. They raised a timber hood over the mouth on the stable, non-thermal ground at the entrance. 6 feet long, 5 wide, under 4 high. Its roof pitched steep to shed loose snow. Lodgepole lashed and pegged and layered with canvas and overlapping boughs. They ran a 30-foot guide rope from a tree by the road to the hood, so a man caught in white weather could find the door by feel. They hung spare clearing rods beside the platform and drove red stakes to mark both vents so they could be found under snow. Gage even carved a small board and hung it inside, simple scratched symbols for the vents, the water, the forbidden flame, and the way out, so that a frightened man who could not think could still look and remember. The first week, the safe path was marked and the platform stood half built, and the low intake drew clean. 12 days had become 8. The second week, the exhaust flue went up, and the fly was fitted, and the drainage ran true. And Allman counted his matches, and found 9 still dry, and looked at his own hands, and found the palms split from driving pegs into frozen wood. The third week the hood was near done. The nights outside fell below 0, and they began the first cautious tests of the temperature inside. The setbacks came the way setbacks always come, one on the back of the last. A north wind pushed backward down the exhaust flue and drove the smoke of an outdoor test fire curling into the cavity, and Gage cursed and added the turning cap that kept the draft drawing the right way. Allman's wet boot rubbed the skin from his heel, and he hit it, ashamed, until blood came through his sock, and Gage saw it and pulled him off the heavy work for a full day. A day Allman spent certain that every hour he sat still was an hour Sloane could point to and say the boy had quit. And then, with the hood nearly finished, the ground itself reminded them what it was. A small tremor moved through the basin one gray morning, no more than a shudder in the teeth, and by noon the rear wall of the cavity had risen several degrees warmer than the range they had logged, and the sulfur smell had thickened. Gage did not weigh it. He ordered every man and woman out of the cavity and off the crust and back to the timber's edge, and he kept them there the whole day, watching the mouth breathe, saying nothing. "It may settle," he said finally, as the light went. "It may not. We do not go back in until it does. And from now on, we log the wall temperature every day at the same hour, and the day it climbs and does not come down, we are done. I mean it, boy. The heat is not our friend. It is a thing we borrow and watch." By morning, the wall had cooled to its old range. They went back in, and they added the daily log, and Allman understood that mastery of this place was not going to look like conquest. It was going to look like a man keeping careful accounts against something that could always call the loan. The help came unasked, which was the only way pride would let Allman take it. Mina returned from Camp Sheridan with more than supplies, a damaged wagon canvas, 2 worn wool blankets, a cracked kettle, a length of stovepipe wire, a bolt end of red cloth for the vent markers. None of it was charity, or none of them would admit it was. Each said the same thing in different words, that a road crew might need the place someday, and a man liked to think he had a hand in the thing that saved him. Baines rode out once to see the progress, and he did not pretend to be pleased. He walked the marked path, looked at the 2 vents and the raised deck and the carved board, and his mouth went tight. "It is better made than I expected," he said. "That is not the same as safe. I will judge it when it is tested and not before. And it will be tested. This is Yellowstone. It always tests everything." Only Sloane refused to give anything, and Sloane found a way to take even in the refusing. The last long roll of canvas the hood needed had come in on his freight, and Sloane held it. He would not deliver it, he said, until his disputed freight bill was settled. The bill for hauling into the country the very boy now wasting government timber on a grave with a roof. Mina paid it out of her own wages in the end, without telling Allman until it was done, and when he protested, she cut him off. "I did not do it for you," she said. "I did it because I want to see the thing finished. There is a difference, and you had best learn it." The hood was finished the next day. They tested it the way Gage tested everything, carefully and with someone he did not trust standing by to disagree. Allman and Gage would spend the night inside. Baines and Mina would keep a tent pitched by the mouth, close enough to hear a shout, and they would take measurements at fixed intervals through the dark. Outside temperature, rear stone temperature, the air at the height of the platform, the air down by the intake. Nothing would be left to a tired man's memory. It would be written down. At sundown, the outside air stood at 12 degrees. The rear stone read 61. The air at platform height read 50. Down by the intake, it read 41. They lay on the raised deck under dry wool, no fire, the caged lamp burning low and even at the mouth, and they listened to the soft, steady hiss of air drawing up the flue and understood that the place was breathing the way it should. Through the night, the cold outside deepened. By the small hours, the tent thermometer had fallen to 2 degrees below zero, and Alman, waking in his shifts to check the vents, could hear Mina and Baines stamping and slapping their arms out in the canvas tent a few feet away, cold as the country itself. Inside, at platform height, the air held at 46. Not warm. Never warm. But 46 degrees was a distance from death, and outside a man's own tent could not keep him from freezing, and Alman lay in that difference and let himself for 1 hour believe. The kettle by the wall had not frozen. His boots, hung on the drying sticks, had gone from soaked to merely damp. The fly caught the ceiling drip and shed it to the trench. No wood had burned. He and Gage slept in turns and inspected the vents each hour, and the numbers held, and it was working. It was working exactly as it had been drawn. Then, an hour before dawn, Gage sat up on the deck and put his hand to his head. "My head aches," he said. Just that. Flat and quiet. But Alman came up off the deck as if he had shouted, because a flat, quiet man saying his head aches in a warm hole in the ground was the oldest warning his father had ever taught him. He looked at the lamp. The flame stood lower than it had, not out. Lower. He did not wait to reason it through. He hauled Gage up, threw open the hood, and got them both out into the killing cold, into the clean burning air, and stood the old man against a tree and made him breathe. And then he went looking for why. He found it at the intake. Through the night, the wind had shifted and packed fine snow into a drift against the low windward opening, and the 4-inch gap that fed their clean air had narrowed to a slit, not closed. Not enough to kill in an hour, but enough to starve the flame low and set an ache behind a sleeping man's eyes, and enough to prove that the place could turn while a man slept and give him almost no warning at all. Baines and Mina had come running at the noise. Baines looked at the drifted intake and the low lamp and the gray-faced foreman leaning on the tree, and he did not gloat. He was too careful a man for that. "Your heat passed inspection," Baines said. "Your air did not." Mina put it harder, because Mina always did. "A shelter that only works while a man stays awake to guard it is not a shelter," she told Alman. "It is a watch. You have built a place a man must never fully rest in. Fix that, or it will do exactly this on the worst night to people too cold to notice it happening." They were both right, and Alman knew it, and this near failure taught him more than the whole warm, successful night had. They rebuilt the intake before they slept again. They gave it a short horizontal snow tunnel so a drift could not seal it flat. They gave it 2 exterior mouths instead of 1, far enough apart that a single drift could not block both. They put a bright marker pole above each and ran a clearing cord inside within reach of a man lying on the deck, so the air could be opened again by someone too weak to stand. It was, Alman thought, the difference between a thing that worked and a thing that would keep working when everything went wrong. He did not yet know how soon everything would. The weather turned strange in the days that followed, and Gage read the strangeness the way another man reads a letter. A warm spell came through and softened the snow, and then the cold slammed back down in a night and froze the softened surface to a hard, glittering crust a man could nearly walk on. Then the barometer at Camp Sheridan, which Baines watched the way Gage watched the wall, began to fall. Slow at first, then faster. Cloud gathered over the plateau and did not move off. Thaw, freeze, fresh snow, then wind, Gage said, standing at the hood and looking south into the massing gray. I have seen that order before. It is the order that kills. The thaw fools everyone into moving. The snow blinds you, and the wind finishes what the snow began. It is the same weather-starving cattle from here to the Dakotas this winter. This whole country is dying under it, slow, and most men do not know it yet. And there was one more thing, small and cold and sharp as a splinter. A freight wagon had gone into the interior days before and had not come back on its schedule. It was overdue at Mammoth, and the wagon belonged to Elbert Sloan. The storm came out of the southwest in the last week of January in the year 1887, and it came the way Gage had said it would. It began with the temperature falling through the afternoon, a steady sinking a man could feel in his lungs. The snow started fat and wet and turned within the hour to fine, hard grains that came sidelong and stung the skin like flung sand. The wind rose until it had a voice, a long, unbroken roar through the lodge poles, and one by one it erased the road stakes, the very markers a man would need to find his way, until the road that had been a road was only more white in a world gone entirely white. Allman, Gage, Mina, and Baines were at the refuge when it hit, and for the first hour they only kept the vents clear and were grateful they were not out in it. Then, through a lull in the wind's roar, they heard the sound that changed the night, a thin metal ringing, far off and irregular, carried on the gusts and lost, and carried again. A cup, Allman thought, a tin cup struck against something, a man's oldest way of saying, I am here, and I cannot come to you. Sloan's overdue wagon had not stayed in the interior. It had been trying to come out, and the storm had caught it on the same stretch of road as the refuge, and somewhere out there in the white it had come to grief. 4 men, they would learn, 1 passenger, 2 wagons and 8 mules, and a mile and a half up the road, one of the wagons had gone over on the iced grade and spilled everything, men and freight and animals, into the storm. Baines made the call a commander makes. No one leaves this shelter until the wind drops, he said. I will not trade the people I have for the people I cannot see. In this, a rescue party dies with the rescued. They will not last the hour, Allman said. You heard the cup. A man does not ring a cup when he's warm. He rings it when he has stopped being able to walk. He was already uncoiling the guide rope. The one who rang it is already going. The others may already be gone. You do not know the road under this. I know the rope. Gage's 30-foot guide line, and behind it a longer freight line coiled at the hood. Allman knotted them together and looped the end around his own waist. Gage could not go. His stiff knee would not carry him 100 feet through drift, and he knew it, and it was the bitterest thing Allman ever saw cross the old man's face. So Gage did the only thing left to him. He took the caged lamp down and pressed it into Allman's hands. You watch this at the wagon before you crawl anywhere, Gage said, and you watch it here every time you come back. You're the airman now, boy. You decide who breathes. He gripped Allman's arm hard. Follow the rope out. Follow the rope back. Do not trust your eyes in this. Your eyes will lie to you, and the rope will not. Allman went out into the white. The wind took the breath out of his mouth. He could not see the hood behind him after 10 steps, could not see the timber, could not see his own boots. There was only the rope taut in his fist and the cold that reached through every seam and the roar. He followed the last few standing road stakes as far as they went and then he followed nothing but the tension of the line and the memory of the road shape. And twice he went off it into deep drift and hauled himself back by the rope alone, and Gage's words held him together. The rope will not lie to you. He found her by sound, not sight. That thin ringing, close now, a cup struck against a wagon wheel over and over, weaker each time. He came up on the overturned wagon out of the white and nearly fell over her. Mina. She was the passenger. She had been coming out from a supply trip, and this was the wagon she rode, and she was on her knees in the lee of the wheel, wringing her cup with a hand that had stopped feeling the cold, keeping herself moving by the only work left to her. Beside her a drover sat in the snow, and he was not shivering any more, and he was picking at the buttons of his own coat with clumsy fingers, trying to take it off, which Alma knew was the last terrible thing the cold does to a man before it finishes him. "Get up!" Alman shouted into the wind. "Both of you, on the rope." He got the drover's arm over Mina's shoulders, and Mina, who had a core of iron in her Alman had never fully seen until that night, slapped the man's hands away from his buttons and forced them around her and would not let him sit again. Alman took the man's other side, and they went hand over hand down the rope toward a shelter none of them could see. 3 people breathing in ragged clouds, the drover's boots dragging, Mina cursing him upright every time his knees folded. They reached the hood. Gage was waiting inside on his bad knee. He had the man's wet outer coat off before he was fully through the door, had him wrapped in dry wool, laid him on the deck, but not against the hottest stone, never against the hottest stone. "Slow," Gage said, working. "You warm a frozen man too fast and his heart stops. Slow, from the middle out." The man was the one who nearly died, and for a long while, as Gage worked over him, it was not certain he would not. If you are invested in Alman's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because reaching the shelter will not mean they are safe. Alman did not stay to see it through. 3 men were still at the wagon, Sloan and an injured teamster and 1 more driver, and the drover he had just carried in kept trying to tell him something through his blue lips, a number. How many? Until Alman understood and went back out into the storm. Baines came with him this far, roped in behind, and partway out a gust snapped a road stake, and Baines lost the shape of the road entirely and stood turning in the white like a man struck blind. It was Alman who kept them true, not by sight but by the pull of the line and the count of his own steps, the way a mine boy learns to move in the dark when his lamp fails. He brought them to the wagon. The injured teamster had a knee twisted under him and could not stand. The second driver was on his feet, but useless with fear. And Sloan was gloveless, his hands ruined, kneeling not over the injured man, but over a strong box, a freight strong box that held the payroll and the receipts, and he would not leave it. He was trying to drag it, to carry it, to save it. "Leave it," Alman shouted. "It is the company's money. It is your death." Alman took his knife and cut the strap that bound the box and shoved it aside into the snow. "You carry it or you live. You do not do both. Choose now, because I am taking these 2 and I will not come back a 3rd time." For 1 terrible second, Sloan looked at the box. Then the cold, or the sense under the cold, won. He left it. He crawled to the rope and took hold, and they got the injured teamster up between them, and they went back down the line into the white with the guide rope already vanishing under the drifting snow behind them, hauling 3 men toward a hole in the ground that a soldier had called a grave, and a freight boss had called a joke, because it was the only warm thing in a world that had turned entirely to killing cold. They made it. All of them made it inside. And that was when the second half of the night began. The refuge had been built for 4. Now it held 6. Alman, Mina, Sloan, 2 drovers, the injured teamster, and Gage. 7 bodies in a space where 2 was comfortable, and every single thing they had built to keep people alive began, under that load, to work against them. 7 people breathe. 7 wet coats and 7 pairs of soaked boots, and Mina's saturated skirt gave up their water into the air, and the air went thick and close. The fly began to drip faster than it could shed. Breath condensed and froze around the exhaust. The low intake, which 2 people never troubled, 6 people's warmth kept plugging faster with rime and drifting snow. The caged lamp at the mouth burned lower. The injured teamster's boot could not be pulled off his swollen foot and had to be cut away with Alman's knife. And Gage, dragging himself from body to body, said the thing Alman dreaded to hear. "This is becoming a sealed room," Gage said. "Too many breaths, boy. Watch the flue." The high exhaust was clogging. Alman knew it before he could see it, knew it by his ears. The soft, steady hiss of rising air, the sound that meant the place was breathing, had gone quiet. He said nothing to frighten the others. He crawled to the flue and put his hand to it and felt no draft, and 2 of the men on the deck said almost at once that their heads had begun to ache. He put every body he could low, near the intake, where the last good air still came. Then he tied himself to the exterior rope and went back out onto the buried hood in the storm. The red marker pole was nearly gone under the snow. He found the exhaust box by memory and the shape of the mound. The clearing rod would not pass. Ice had grown thick around the turning cap, a solid collar of rime frozen hard where the warm, damp breath met the killing cold. He climbed up onto the hood in the roaring dark with the hammer, and he swung at the ice, and on the 3rd blow his boots went out from under him on the snow-slick timber, and he slid aswau, one leg off the edge of the hood, off the stable ground, out over an untested patch of crust that could have been a lid over a pot of scalding water for all he knew. He caught himself on the rope. He hung there a moment with his heart going like the hammer, and then he pulled himself back onto the timber and swung again, and the ice let go, and the flue cleared with a sudden rush of warm, damp air into his face. The hole-held breath of the shelter released at once. He lay on the hood in the storm and breathed and shook. Below him, through the timber and canvas, 7 people were breathing again because he had not let go of the rope. He crawled back inside to find the cure had made a new sickness. The flue, cleared, now drew hard, and the hard draft pulled the crowded warmth out with the stale air, and the temperature at the deck dropped into the upper 30s, and the injured men, half wet, began to shiver in a way that in one of them looked dangerous. It was Mina who solved it, and Alman was glad past words that she did, because he had reached the end of what one person could think of in one night. She saw that several of the blankets had gone wet through from all the bodies in the dripping fly, and she tore down part of the condensation fly itself, the dry underside of it, and reversed it, and laid it as a fresh, dry inner layer over the injured teamster and the drover who had nearly died, a dry skin between wet men and colder air. "Warmth is nothing if it is wet warmth," she said, working fast. "Dry first, always dry first." And the shivering eased. Then Gage went down. His bad knee, which had carried him through the whole terrible night on will alone, swelled tight and would not bend, and he could no longer drag himself to the vents, could no longer reach the controls, could no longer be the man who decided. He knew it before Alman did. He caught the boy's sleeve and pressed the caged lamp into his hands a second time, and this time it was not a task he was handing over. It was the whole of it. You are the airman, Gage said low so the others would not hear the weight in it. I cannot get to it. You decide whether we stay or whether we take our chances in the storm. You. Watch the flame. Watch the wall. Watch their faces. And do not assume the worm is failing just because you are afraid. Fear is not information. Look, then decide. And almost as he said it, the sulfur came. It rose thick and sudden, the way it had on Almond's first night, and behind it the dull ache pressed at his own forehead, and two of the men groaned and put their hands to their heads. Every instinct Almond had screamed the thing Gage had warned him against. The ground is turning. The worm is killing us. Run. To run 7 people, 2 of them near death, out into a storm that would finish them in minutes. He did not run. He looked. He watched the flame, low but steady, not the deep starve of true bad air. He put his hand to the wall, warm, but no warmer than the logs said it should be. And he watched, and he waited 3 breaths he did not think he could spare, and he noticed the thing that saved them all. The smell did not come steadily. It came in pushes. It came only when the wind, howling and shifting outside, drove downward through one of the 2 exterior openings, driving the ground's own bad breath back down into the room instead of letting it rise and go. It was not the ground turning. It was the wind, using his own vent against him. He crawled to that opening, and he did not seal it. He never sealed it. He heard Gage's rule and his father's rule as one voice. If you cannot keep 2 breaths open, you do not stay for 1. He shielded it, partly with a folded coat, cutting the wind's downward drive without closing the passage, and he opened the opposite intake wider to pull the air the right way through. And he waited. The smell thinned. The ache behind his eyes let go. The men on the deck stopped groaning. He had read the ground the way Gage taught him, and it had told him the truth, and he had believed the truth over his own fear, and 7 people kept breathing in the dark. Outside, the storm did to everyone else what it does. At the gray edge of morning, when the wind at last began to fall, they would find one of the freight tents collapsed a mile off, a flat white shape filled and buried with drifted snow, nothing living in it. The overturned wagon had made a wind pocket, but no warmth, and warmth was the only thing that mattered, and 2 of the 8 mules were dead in their traces where they had stood. The rest had broken free and huddled in a timber hollow and lived. A canvas tent in that wind was a shroud waiting to be filled, a low hole in the earth, out of the wind, breathing through 2 guarded vents, warmed by the ground and by the bodies inside it, and by not one splinter of burning wood that had held. By the numbers, when Allman and Gage reckoned them later, the night had run to about minus 45 degrees outside. The rear stone had held between 59 and 62 the whole time. The crowded deck had stayed between 42 and 47. The air by the entrance hovered near freezing and no lower. They had been inside near 31 hours before the wind let them out. Not a stick of wood had burned. 7 people had gone in and 7 people came out. One with a frostbitten hand that would never be right. One with a knee that would trouble him the rest of his days. One who had come within an hour of freezing in the snow beside a wagon wheel. But 7. All 7, breathing in the morning. Baines was the one who opened the hood at last, when the roar outside had dropped to a mutter and the light had come. He pushed back the canvas and the boughs and the drifted snow and stood in the low mouth of the shelter. And the morning came in pale and clean and unbearably bright after the long dark sigh, and it struck the steam rising off the ground and off the living, breathing people crowded inside, 7 of them, alive, in a hole the army had meant to close. For a moment no one spoke. There was only the light and the steam and the fact of them all still there. Then Gage, who had been staring past Baines's shoulder into the back of the cavity while the light reached in, lifted one hand and pointed. Along the rear wall, running through the warm mineral crust where none had been the night before, was a fresh crack. The shelter had held. 7 people had lived a night that killed the mules and buried the tent, and would be counted up and down that country, among the worst any of them had seen. They had proved every rule. The raised deck, the doubled vents, the dry layer, the refusal of fire, the reading of the wind. All of it had worked. And the ground, the only thing none of them could build or control, had just told them in one thin line across the stone that it might never let them do it again. For 2 days after the storm, the survivors slept and ate and mended in the frame buildings at Camp Sheridan, and the frost-bitten teamster lost the tip of one finger, and the drover who had nearly frozen wept once in the stable when he thought no one could hear him, and then never spoke of it again. That was the whole of the aftermath. Almond did not let himself sit in it. There was a crack in the rear wall of the refuge, and a soldier watching him for the first sign he had endangered 7 lives, and the only way through both was forward. Baines rode out to the basin himself to render the verdict. He brought 2 soldiers, a mercury thermometer and merit gauge, whose knee had been bound and splinted so he could hobble the marked path on a crutch cut from lodgepole. Baines wanted the site emptied, measured, and guarded, and he wanted, above all, to know whether the fresh crack in the mineral crust had been opened by the ground or by the boy's timber hood. If Almond's building had split the crust, then the whole thing was reckless meddling with a feature the army was sworn to protect, and it would be sealed and Almond sent south, and the 7 survivors would not change that. Gage settled the question on his knees in the cold. He put his hands to the crack and traced it, and he showed Baines where it ran, down into the natural center, following the grain of the old mineral, nowhere near the pegs and lashings of the hood, which sat on stable stone a full body length away. The ground did this, Gage said. Not the boy. His timber never touched this rock. The earth cracked because the earth cracks. It was doing it long before he came, and it will do it long after we seal it. Baines wrote it down. He measured the outside air and the rear stone in the deck, and he wrote those down too, and the numbers were the numbers Almond had reckoned, a cavity that held near 60 degrees in its stone, while the world outside had gone to 40 below. The soldier read his own figures a long time before he spoke. Then Baines did the thing Almond had not let himself expect. He straightened, and he took off his glove, and he held out his bare hand to a boy the whole camp had been calling a corpse, who walked back. I told you a warm hole in Yellowstone was a grave with steam in it, Baines said. I've thought about that for 2 days, and here's the truth of it. Without your vents, I would have been right. That crowd of us, sealed in the warm with no way for the bad air to leave, we would have gone to sleep in there and never woken, and it would have proved every word I said. He gripped Almond's hand. But you did not seal it. You built it to breathe. And so instead of proving me right, that hole let me carry 7 living people home. I was not wrong about the danger. I was wrong about you. It was not surrender, and Almond did not take it as surrender. Baines never once said the ground was safe. He said the opposite, in the same breath, that the feature was unstable, that the crack proved it, that no untrained traveler could ever be let near it, that it would never be a home or business or private claim, that its one success had depended entirely on ventilation and discipline and a man awake to watch it. But he wrote in his report that on one night, this cavity, handled with care, had reduced the exposure of a stranded party and preserved their lives. That was all Almond had ever asked for. Not ownership, a true accounting. The accounting stacked up over the following weeks, the way Gage said good proof always did, in layers from the inside out. The first layer was Almond's own, and it meant nothing to anyone but him. The unfrozen kettle, the living men, the biscuit that bent when the other had shattered. The second layer was the army's cold mercury, the numbers in Baines's own hand that no man could argue with. The third layer was Mina's, and it was the one that shut the last mouths. She had grown tired of men saying the shelter worked, but drowned you slow, so she settled the moisture question the way she settled everything, with a demonstration a fool could follow. She took 3 strips of the same wet wool, wrung to the same dampness, and she hung one inside the ventilated hood, one inside an ordinary canvas tent, and one outside in the still air of a windless morning. Then she made the doubters wait and watch. The strip in the still outside air went stiff and froze. The strip in the closed canvas tent stayed clammy and cold for hours. The strip in the hood, where the drawn air moved steadily past it, dried first and dried through. There, Mina said, holding up the dry strip and the frozen one side by side. The heat is not the whole of it. The moving air is. A warm place that does not breathe will soak you. A place that breathes will dry you. That is the difference between a shelter and a coffin, and now you have seen it with your own eyes, so I will thank you to stop asking. The fourth layer was Baines's admission, already given. The fifth was Sloane's, and Sloane gave it the only way a man like Sloane could, sideways and grudging, and without a single word of apology. He came to the stable one gray morning and put a small canvas roll of coins on the rail beside Almond without meeting his eye. 6 days' wages, the full figure, the same 6 days he had torn in half in the road. He did not say he had been wrong to leave the boy. He did not say the boy had saved his life at the wagon, cutting his beloved strongbox loose and shouting him onto the rope. He said only, "That squares us," and turned to go. "It does not square the harness pin you never lost," Almond said to his back, "nor the rope I never stole." Sloane stopped. For a moment Almond thought he might finally say it. Then the freight boss's shoulders set, and he walked out without another word, and Almond understood that the wages were not repentance. They were the price of shutting a door Sloane wanted shut, so he could reopen it later on his own terms. Those terms came within the month. Word of the refuge had spread down the road and into Gardner and Cinnabar, the way any story of 7 men saved from a killing storm will spread, and the story grew legs and lost its cautions in the telling, until men were saying there was a warm cave in the park where a fellow could winter snug as a bear. Road workers began coming to Almond, not to mock now, but to ask. A teamster who dreaded the interior runs wanted to know why the sleeping deck stood so high off the floor. A young soldier posted to a lonely patrol cabin wanted to know why the 2 vents faced away from one another. A freighter who had lost a brother to a cabin fire wanted to know how a man kept warm with no fire at all. Almond answered every one of them the way Gage had taught him, not with a lecture, but with a thing they could see. He built a little model vent out of a tin can and a scrap of pipe, and he lit the caged lamp inside it, and then he stuffed the intake with wool, and the men watched the flames sink low and yellow and struggle, and he pulled the wool free and watched it come back bright, and no man who saw that ever again asked why 2 vents mattered. He took a flat sheet of canvas and Mina's pitched fly, and he poured a cup of water across each, and the flat sheet held the water in a sagging belly until it dumped all at once, and Mina's fly shed every drop clean to the side, and no man who saw that argued about the pitch of a roof again. "You teach it better than you built it," Gage told him one evening, watching. And then, because Gage never gave a compliment without a load behind it, he added, "Which means it is time you and I stopped building this one thing and started building the right thing everywhere." The men who came were not an idea to Almond. They were faces, each with a fear he could name. There was Oddman Solheim, a freighter of 50 with a bad chest, who had watched a partner die in a stalled wagon 2 winters back and could not make the interior runs anymore without his hands shaking on the lines. He wanted to know, quietly, so the younger men would not hear, whether an old man could dig himself a safe place to wait out a storm without help. There was a corporal named Aslak posted alone to a patrol cabin at Norris for the winter, who had heard that a man could freeze in a cabin with a roaring stove going and did not understand how and needed to. There was a widow and gardener outfitting her late husband's freight wagon for a nephew, who came with a list of questions written on the back of a feed bill because she would not send the boy into that country as ignorant as her husband had been. Alman answered each of them by hand, on the ground, with the thing in front of them. To Solheim he showed how a lone man could throw up a low windbreak of earth and boughs against a bank in an hour, and where to put the 2 gaps for air, and why he must never, ever roof it tight and light a fire under it to warm his failing chest. To the Corporal Aslak he explained the thing that killed men in warm cabins, that a stove burning behind a sealed door ate the same air the man breathed, and gave back an air that looked like nothing and killed like poison, and that the answer was not less fire but more air, a cracked window even in the cold, a chimney kept clear. The corporal went white listening, thinking of every sealed winter night he had already survived by luck. The widow copied Alman's answers onto her feed bill in a small, careful hand and made him check that she had them right before she would leave. He never charged one of them a cent, and Gage watched him give the knowledge away and nodded as though a debt were being paid that Alman could not see. That was the beginning of the work that mattered more than the refuge ever had, and it was the work that deepened everything between the old man and the boy. Because Merritt Gage had decided that the refuge, for all it had done, was a trap dressed as a triumph, and he set out to prove it to Alman, who did not want to hear it. They clashed over it hard, one night in the frame building, in the only real quarrel they ever had. Alman wanted to improve the geothermal refuge, to build more like it wherever the ground breathed warm, to spread the very thing that had saved 7 lives. Gage would not have it. "You are in love with the thing that saved you," Gage said. "I have seen it before. A man survives one hole and thinks the hole is his friend. But the hole is not your friend, boy. The hole is a loaded gun that happened to point the other way one night. You want to hand loaded guns to every teamster on this road and tell them they are shelters." He shook his gray head. "Every warm hole is different. Some breathe good air, some breathe poison you cannot smell. Some hold steady, some flood with scalding water in an afternoon. You cannot teach a freighter to read the ground in a day, and if you tell him warm holes are safe, he will crawl into the first one he finds, and it will kill him, and it will be your rules that put him there." 7 people lived, Alman said, hot. "You would have me pretend that did not happen." 7 people lived because you spent a winter learning to read that one hole, and because I stood over you the whole time, and because we were lucky the crack came in the morning instead of the night. Luck is not a rule you can write down. Gage leaned across the table. What saved those men was not the warm ground. It was the vents, the dry deck, the reading of the wind, the refusing of fire, the willingness to go out in the storm and not seal the door. Those things do not need a geyser, boy. Those things work on any ground, on ordinary cold, stable ground that will not turn on you in the night. That is the thing worth teaching. The heat was the least important part of that whole terrible night, and if you make it the lesson, you will have learned nothing and taught less. It landed on Almond the way only a true thing can, hard and unwelcome. He sat with it a long while, and then he did the thing that made Gage, at last, treat him as an equal rather than a pupil. He changed his mind. They built the first of the surface shelters that spring at a bad bend on the northern road, a place where the wind funneled between two ridges and where, over the years, more than one wagon had been caught. Almond chose the ground the way Gage had taught him to choose ground now, not for warmth, but for what it would not do. Stable, dry, no hollow note under the rod. He wanted no gift from the earth that the earth might take back. They cut into the lee of a low bank and raised a half-height berm of turf and earth, and pitched the roof steep enough that no snow could pile and crush it. And inside, they built the sleeping deck raised off the floor exactly as they had in the cavity, because a man on cold ground loses his heat to the ground whether the ground is warm or not. Two vents opposed, marked with red poles that stood a head height above the deepest snow anyone had ever seen there, a guide rope to a post by the road, a box of dry blankets sealed against damp, and on the wall the plank with the 5 rules, and beside it, at Mina's insistence, a second smaller board with her own short list of what to do with wet clothing and how to know a freezing man from a merely cold one. "It gives you nothing," a young soldier said, standing in the finished shelter, disappointed. "It's not even warm." "It is not meant to be warm," Almond said. "It is meant to keep the wind off you and let you breathe and keep you dry until the storm passes. Warm is what kills men, when they chase it into sealed rooms and burning cabins and holes in the ground. This will not make you comfortable. It will make you alive. Learn the difference now before the country teaches it to you." Mina, checking her board on the wall, glanced at Almond when he said it, and something passed between them that neither named, because it was the sound of him saying, in his own words, the things she had told a soaked and stubborn boy in a steaming basin a lifetime ago. They worked side by side through the thaw, and in the working Gage's story came out in pieces, the way an old man's story does. He had timbered in Pennsylvania as a young man in the same coal country where Almond's father had died, and when Almond named the district, Gage went quiet and said he might have known the man, or 100 men like him, all of them good, and all of them gone into the ground. Gage had gone to the war after that, and come home to a country that had no more use for him than for a spent shell, and gone west and timbered the Colorado silver mines until a fall of rock took his knee and half his wind and all his taste for going underground. He had come to the road work because it was above ground where a man could see the sky, and he had spent 15 years closing the kind of holes that had crippled him because he could not save the men already buried, but he could keep the next fool out of the next grave. "That is why they sent me to close yours," Gage said. "I have never in my life looked at a warm hole and wanted to save it. Not once. Yours is the only one." He looked at Almond a moment. "Because you were the only one who was more afraid of it than I was." Together, before the thaw was through, they wrote the rules down. 5 of them, scratched onto a plank in Gage's blocky hand, to hang in every shelter they built. Never enter untested thermal ground alone. Never seal a natural opening. Never depend upon one vent. Never sleep directly on wet stone. Leave it once when the smell, the flame, the heat, the water, or your own body tells you something has changed. "Those 5 will save more men than your hole ever did," Gage said, and Almond did not argue because he had come to believe it. But the old man was failing, and both of them knew it, and neither would say it. The knee that the storm had wrenched never fully came back, and the wind he had lost in the Colorado rockfall grew shorter with each cold morning, until a walk to the road left him gray and leaning, one hand pressed to his chest. The high country was killing him by inches, the way it killed everything that stayed too long. And in the last week of the thaw, Merritt Gage told Alman he was going down to Livingston, to lower ground and thicker air, to lighter work near the railroad while he still had breath to work at all. He did not make a speech of it. He handed Alman the caged lamp. Alman knew the lamp. It was the one Gage had pressed on him twice in the storm, the one that had hung in the mouth of the refuge and burned low the night the intake drifted shut. But Gage had done something to it before he gave it over. On the leather of the carrying case, where a word had been stamped long ago, safe, the maker's proud claim, Gage had taken his knife and scratched the word out entirely, and below it, in the leather, he had cut a single new word. Warning. A tool does not decide, Gage said, holding it out. It never has, and it never will. This flame will tell you some things and lie to you about others, same as it always has. It only gives a man one more reason to think. If you ever forget that, if you ever look at this and feel safe instead of watchful, then throw it in the river, because it will have started killing you. He put it in Alman's hands and closed the boy's fingers around it with his own. You do not need me anymore. You have not needed me for a while. That is the whole of what a man like me is for. Then he got into the Livingston wagon, and it took him down the road, and Alman stood watching it thin into the distance the way, months before, he had stood in the road watching another wagon leave him with nothing. But this was the opposite of that morning. This time the wagon carried away the man who had given him everything, and left him not with nothing but with all of it, the lamp, the rules, the reading of the ground, and the terrible new weight of being the one who decided. Snow still lay in the shadowed places along the road. A single crow crossed the pale sky above the departing wagon and did not call. Alman held the lamp against his chest, the crossed-out word beneath his thumb, and understood that some inheritances arrive only when the one who gives them is already too far down the road to thank. If the story reminds you that preparation is knowledge and not equipment alone, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The ground tested him, alone, before the summer was out. He had gone back to the guarded refuge with a young road worker named Peter Tveit to take the season's readings and check the fencing, and the moment Alman put his hand to the rear wall, he knew something had changed. The stone was warmer than the log had ever recorded. Water dripped from a crack that had been dry all winter, and the sulfur, when the breeze shifted, came stronger than he had smelled it since the night of the storm. Tveit, who was strong and eager and had heard the tale of the seven, saw only good in it. "Warmer is better, is it not?" he said, ducking toward the mouth. "More heat. That is the whole point of the... Out!" Alman caught his collar and pulled him back from the crust. "Warmer is not better. Warmer is the ground telling us it is doing something new, and we do not know what, and we do not go in to find out." He heard his own voice, and it was Gage's voice and his father's voice, all three at once. "Warmer is exactly the sign. We leave. We fence it deeper. We log it, and we go." Tveit thought him overcautious, and said so, and Alman did not argue the point. He simply lowered the caged lamp into the mouth on its cord, the way his father had lowered a lamp into a Pennsylvania cavity 30 years before, and the two of them watched. The flame burned steady at the lip. Then Alman paid out the cord, lowering the lamp toward the warm rear wall, and near the bottom, where the heat pooled and the fresh water dripped, and a cold man would most want to lie down, the flame sank. It shrank and yellowed and guttered low, starved of the good air, in exactly the place a tired traveler would have made his bed. Tveit stopped talking about warmer being better. They hauled the lamp up, and they fenced the site off entirely that same day, and Alman wrote in the log the thing he had learned, that the whole winter of building had only pointed toward, that mastery of such a place was never the power to make it work under all conditions. It was the humility to know and to act on knowing when it must not be used at all. He had wanted once to spread the warm refuge to every road in the park. Now he was the first man to order it closed. The two feelings lived in him at the same time, and he let them, because Gage had taught him that a man who felt only one of them was a man who would eventually die of the other. Then they moved the emergency platform out of the natural cavity for good, onto stable ground beneath a low timber hood a body length from the mouth, where a traveler could take the modest warmth breathing from the opening without ever sleeping inside the geological feature itself. The safer outer bay never rose above the upper 30s in deep cold, but it held that warmth honestly, out of the wind, with almost none of the gas risk. And Alman came to prize it more than the cavity that had made his name, because it could be trusted, and the cavity never fully could. The last test of that summer was not the ground. It was Sloane. Alman smelled it before he saw it. The old sulfur, and under it wood smoke where no wood smoke should be, riding out toward a steaming depression a few miles off the road where a traveler had reported a light. He came over a rise and found a canvas awning pitched low over a warm opening, sealed down tight on every side against the cold, and beneath it a small iron brazier burning, and around the brazier 4 or 5 paying travelers dozing in the warmth, wrapped in blankets, their faces slack. There was no high vent. There was no exhaust of any kind. It was every single thing Gage had spent his life closing, built by a man who had watched Alman build the opposite and understood none of it. Sloane stood at the edge of it, collecting his coin. He had called the place, a sign said, Vale's Natural Furnace, though Alman had never in his life given his name to such a thing, and had told Sloane so to his face when the freight boss first proposed the scheme. It was never mine, Alman had said then. Sloane had not listened then, and he did not listen now. Put it out, Alman said, going straight for the brazier. The fire and the seal both. You have made a sealed room over warm ground with a fire eating the air inside it. There's not one safe breath under this canvas. Get them up. Get them out. Now. You are protecting your own reputation, Sloane said, stepping in front of him. You want to be the only man in this country who can sell warmth to a freezing traveler. That is all this is. Alman did not have time to answer him because one of the sleeping customers proved the argument better than any word could. The man stood to see what the shouting was and took 2 steps into the open air, and his knees folded under him, and he went down in the snow, dizzy and gray, and clutching at the ground as though it were tilting beneath him. It was the first stage of the very thing Alman's father had warned him of at 7 years old, the thing that had put the ache behind Gage's eyes on the test night. Bad air, doing its quiet work on men who felt only warm and drowsy and safe. They dragged all of them out into the cold, and they revived on the clean air, coughing and confused, and none of them died. But it had been close, closer than any of them understood, and Sloane stood over the collapsed man in the trampled snow, and for the first time in his life had nothing at all to say. He had abandoned a boy in the road and called it discipline. He had withheld wages and called it a debt. He had copied a shelter he did not understand and called it business, and put his own paying customers to sleep in a poisoned room, and only the accident of Alman riding by had kept it from becoming a row of frozen graves he would have had to explain. Alman looked at him across the fallen man, and he did not gloat because Gage had never gloated, and the country was too serious for it. The heat, Alman said quietly, was never the dangerous part. It was never the important part either. You watched me build the thing that mattered all winter, and you saw only the warm hole. That is why yours nearly killed these people, and mine did not." Sloane said nothing, but something had cracked in him, the way the crust had cracked in the refuge wall, a thin line running deep that would not close again on its own. By the end of that first summer, Almond Vale was no longer the corpse who walked back. He was the man the road workers came to before the season turned, the man whose 5 scratched rules hung in 3 new shelters on the northern road, the man who had ordered closed the very grave that had saved him and been proven right within the season. The mentor who had made him was gone down to Livingston with a failing chest. The freight boss who had thrown him away had been broken open by his own imitation, but had not yet said the words that would set either of them free. And a young woman named Mina Cottrell kept the temperature logs and the clothing rules and stood at his shoulder at every demonstration, and neither of them had yet said aloud the thing that had been growing between them since a morning in a steaming basin when she looked at a living boy and decided he was worth arguing with. What all of it would come to, whether Sloane would ever finish breaking or heal over hard, whether the woman at his shoulder would stay one, whether a life could be built on knowing when not to trust the ground. None of it was settled yet. Almond hung Gage's lamp by the door of the new shop room in Gardner. The crossed-out word turned outward, so any man who entered would read it. Warning. And under it, he began to teach. The collapsed customer did not die, but the story of him did not die either, and it reached Camp Sheridan before Sloane could bury it. A paying traveler had gone down gray and dizzy under a canvas awning bearing another man's name on ground the army was sworn to protect, in a park where no man was permitted to sell shelter over a thermal feature at all. Baines convened an inquiry. He was not a man who let a near-killing pass as a bad night's luck. They held it in the largest of the frame buildings, with Baines at the table and a handful of soldiers along the wall, and, on the benches, the men whose lives had crossed in that country over the past year. Almond came because he was summoned. Mina came because she would not be kept away. And Sloane came in his good coat, having decided in the days between the collapse and the inquiry that the way to save himself was to bury the boy first. He did it plainly. He stood when Baines called him and told the room that Almond Vale had approved the warming camp, had, in fact, designed it, taken a share, lent his name to the sign that read, "Vale's Natural Furnace." If a man had fallen ill under that canvas, Sloane said, then the fault lay with the famous young shelter builder whose methods the whole country now praised, not with a simple freighter who had only carried out what the expert told him. It was a good lie in that it used the truth's own shape. Almond felt the room turn to look at him, and he felt the old shame rise, the shame of the road and the torn wage chit, the certainty that a confident man's word would once again outweigh a poor one's. He had built his name on being trusted. Sloane had just told the one man whose judgment mattered that the name was a fraud. Almond started to answer. Mina stood up first. She did not raise her voice. She laid a plank on the table in front of Baines, the plank of 5 rules in Merritt Gage's blocky hand that hung in every shelter Almond had built, and she read them aloud, slow, so the room could not mistake them. Never enter untested thermal ground alone. Never seal a natural opening. Never depend upon one vent. Never sleep directly on wet stone. Leave at once when the ground tells you it has changed. That is the man's method, Mina said, setting the plank down. In his own teacher's hand, hung in 9 shelters on this road, taught to every freighter who ever asked him. It forbids a sealed room. It forbids one vent. It forbids depending on warm ground at all. She looked at Sloane. Now show the room where in these 5 rules you find the awning you sealed on every side, the fire you burned inside it, and the single warm hole you built it over. Show me which of these rules told you to do that. There is not one. You did the opposite of every word this man teaches, and then you painted his name on it. Sloane said the rules meant nothing, that any man could scratch words on a board after the fact. So Baines called the customer. He was a wool buyer from Bozeman, still shaky a week on, and he stood and told it simply. He had been cold, he said, and the awning had been warm, and he had been glad of it. And when he and the others complained of a draft coming through a gap at the top of the canvas, the proprietor, sorry, he pointed at Sloane, had climbed up and covered it over, sealed it tight against the cold, to please his paying guests. Within the hour, the wool buyer had grown drowsy and warm and content, and then he had stood, and the ground had tilted, and that was the last he knew until he woke in the snow with young Vale slapping his face and shouting at him to breathe. He covered the vent, the wool buyer said. We asked him to. We did not know. He should have known. The room went quiet, and in that quiet, something in Elbert Sloane finally gave way. Not to kindness, he had little of that, but to the plain exhausting weight of a thing that would no longer be carried. He sat down without being told to. He put his ruined hands on his knees. And he said the words at last, flat and grudging and true. He had left the boy in the road, he said, because the boy would not whip a mule and Sloane had wanted him gone. He had torn the wages out of spite. He had lost no harness pin, and the boy had stolen no rope. He had said those things to save his contract when it began to look bad. He had watched the boy build his shelter all that winter, and had seen only a warm hole in a fool, and he had copied the warm hole and none of the rest of it, because the rest of it had looked to him like fussing, like a boy playing at engineer. He had sealed the vent because the customers were cold, and cold customers did not pay. I thought the heat was the whole of it, Sloane said. He was not looking at Alman. He was looking at his own hands. I watched him work a whole winter, and I thought the trick was finding warm ground and keeping the wind off it. That was all I ever saw. He was quiet a moment. Vale knew the heat was the least important thing in that hole. He knew it from the first night. I never understood it until the air went bad and a man fell down at my feet. He looked up then, at Baines, not at Alman. That is the truth of it. Do with me what you want. Baines did what the law and the country required. Sloane's freight privilege in the park was suspended. He would haul under another contractor's bond and another man's supervision, or he would not haul in Yellowstone at all. There was no prison in it, and no ruin, only the slow public shrinking of a man who had thought himself larger than the country and been corrected. Before he closed the inquiry, Baines turned to Alman, and he spoke so the whole room would carry it out with them. A year ago, I called that boy's shelter a grave with steam in it, and I have had to eat those words twice now, once when it saved my life, and again today, when the man who mocked it built the grave I warned against and nearly filled it. He tapped the plank of 5 rules still lying on his table. Learn which man in this room understood the danger and which one only smelled the warmth. One of them is why you will go home tonight. The other is why we held this inquiry at all. Then he dismissed them, and the men filed out past the plank, and more than one of them stopped to read it before he went. But that was not quite the end of Sloane, and the part that was not the end was the part Alman remembered longest. Late that spring, a wagon left a load of good dry timber at the newest road shelter, the one at the bad bend between the ridges, with no bill and no name attached. The teamster said only that it had been paid for already by a man who did not want his name on it. Alman knew the splice on the rope that had lashed the load. He knew the hand. Sloane never spoke of it, and Alman never thanked him, and the two of them lived out their years in that country as men who had settled something without ever once becoming friends. It was not forgiveness. It was something colder and more honest, an account finally brought true. The work by then had grown past anything Alman had imagined in the road, with 38 cents in his pocket. He and Mina took a shop room in Gardner, outside the park's boundary, on the ground where a man was allowed to build a life. In winter, the little shop was the busiest place in town. A working day there ran from before light to after dark. Alman was at the bench by lamplight, a freighter's torn storm canvas across his knees, sewing the sleeved vents his shelters needed, while Mina took the front of the shop and the steady traffic of men coming in off the cold road. A teamster would come for a harness splice, and Alman would do it the way his father had, short berry and whipped end, and while his hands worked, his mouth would be teaching why the man's camp platform should stand off the ground, why the little iron stove he was so proud of would kill him in a sealed wagon box. A homesteader's wife came in for a coil of guide rope and left with a lesson on how to find a buried door by feel. A pair of young drovers came to buy one of the emergency kits Alman made up. A coil of rope, 2 clearing rods, a folded dry blanket, a strip of red cloth. And stayed an hour because Mina would not sell it to them until she was satisfied they knew what every piece was for. Alman would not price those kits high. He said a thing that kept a man alive should never be sold out of reach of the men most likely to need it, and Mina, who had a better head for money than he did, let him lose a little on everyone because she believed the same. They replaced worn wagon canvas and sewed vents and repaired harness and built raised camp platforms to order, knocked down flat for hauling and pegged up in an hour on the road. But the trade was never really the trade. The trade was the reason men stood still long enough to be taught, and they taught. That was the heart of it. Freighters came in for a canvas repair and left, knowing how to tell a merely cold man from a freezing one, how the shivering stops just before the dying starts, why a man pulling at his own warm buttons in the snow is a man an hour from death. Alman taught it, and Mina taught it, and her shortboard on the wall, dry clothes kept apart from wet, canvas pitched and never hung flat, wool aired at every chance, vents cleared before the bedding is laid, got copied so often that the freight companies began pasting it into the front of their own supply ledgers, so that a driver drawing his winter stores read Mina Cottrell's rules before he read the price of flour. The country itself changed around them, slow, in ways a man could point to. Low emergency huts went up along the worst stretches of the northern road, each with its 2 red vent poles standing above the snow. Road parties began carrying the paired clearing rods as a matter of course, the way they carried an axe. The Army wrote adequate blankets and storm canvas into the freight contracts, and required that an overdue wagon be reported and not merely waited on so that no boy would again be thrown into a storm and simply forgotten. And the warm openings in the ground, the dead geysers the freighters had once crawled into out of the wind, were marked now not as free furnaces, but as what they were. Hazards fenced and posted, graves for the man who did not understand them. The proof that the knowledge had truly left him, that it was no longer his but the country's, came on an ordinary winter afternoon when a freighter Alman barely remembered teaching came into the shop and would not leave until he had shaken his hand. The man had been caught out with a green driver on the Norris Road in a 3-day blow. He had done, he said, exactly what Alman had drilled into him over a canvas repair years before. He had not run for warmth. He had put the boy on the rope, found the marked hut by its red poles, cleared both vents before he did anything else, stripped the boy's wet coat and kept him off the cold floor, and burned nothing. 2 days they had waited it out, cold and dull and alive, and walked out when the wind fell. "I never saw your face while I did it," the freighter said. "I only heard you saying it. Dry first. 2 breaths open. Warm is what kills you." He had gone home to his family because a man he half remembered had made him practice a thing until it was a reflex. Alman shook his hand and said little, and after the man had gone, he stood at the bench a long moment, because that was the whole of it right there. The refuge had saved 7. The rules were beginning to save men who would never once need him in the room. He kept up the road inspections himself each season under the Army's bond, long after the shop could have kept him home. He said it was because a man who taught a thing owed it to the thing to keep his own hands in it. The truth was, he did not trust anyone else to be hard enough. On one late autumn round, he came to a new shelter a contractor had thrown up quick to earn his bond, and Alman walked at once and ordered it torn down on the spot. The man had built it snug and low and warm-looking, with a single fine vent and a tight-fitting door, and he was proud of how it held the heat. "That is the trouble with it," Alman told him, in front of the man's own crew, and he said the 5 rules aloud one by one, and made the contractor show him where this shelter obeyed them, and the contractor could not because it obeyed none. "You have built a handsome coffin," Alman said. "1 vent, and a door adrift conceal, and no way for a tired man to open his air from inside. It will keep a party warm right up until it kills them in their sleep, and they will die grateful." They tore it down and built it again his way, with the 2 opposed vents and the inside clearing cord and the door that could not close all the way, and the contractor never forgave him and never built another bad one either. Alman counted both of those as the job done. It was in the middle of all that work that Alman at last said the thing to Mina he had been circling for 2 years, and he said it wrong, and she loved him for saying it wrong. What decided him was a night late in a hard winter, when a mail carrier and his son came off the road half frozen and hammered on the dark shop door. Alman and Mina got up and worked them without a word passing between them that was not necessary, and it was the wordlessness that Alman marked. She had the wet coats off before he had the lamp lit. He had the boy on a bench off the cold floor before she asked. She warmed them slow from the middle out, the way Gage had taught them both, and she caught the father's hands away from the stove when the man in his confusion tried to thrust them straight into the heat. They moved around each other in the small room like 2 hands of the same body, each knowing where the other would be, and by the gray of morning the mail carrier and his son were sitting up drinking broth and arguing about the weather, alive. When they had gone, Alman stood in the emptied shop and understood that he had not thought once all night about doing any of it alone, because he never did it alone anymore. And the idea of the shop without her in it had become as strange as the idea of the road without the ground under it. He did not ask her to marry him first. He asked her to be his partner in the shop, an equal partner, her name beside his on the door, because he had watched her tear down his fly and rebuild it, keep the logs he forgot, read the wool buyer's testimony out of the air and turn a whole inquiry with it, and he could no more run the thing without her than run it without his hands. He laid it out like a business, halting and formal, listing her contributions as though she did not know them, and Mina let him get all the way to the end. "You are asking me to spend my life in this shop with you," she said when he finished. "As a partner, yes, an equal share." "In the shop." Alman understood slowly the size of what he had failed to say. "And in the rest of it," he managed. "If you would, the shop and the rest of it both." "You built that backward," Mina said, but she was smiling, the hard, bright smile she had given him the first morning over the 2 biscuits, the smile that meant she had found a thing worth arguing with. "Fix the water I told you once, fix the air, then ask me." She took his split, calloused hand in her 2 hands. "You fix them. Ask me properly and I will say yes to all of it." He fixed it. She said yes. They married in Gardner in the spring, in the plain way that suited them both, and went back to work the same week. The marriage was built the way the shelters were built, out of shared labor on stable ground. She kept the books and the logs and the front of the shop. He kept the bench and the road inspections he still ran each season under the Army's bond. When they argued, and they argued often, it was the old argument in new clothes. She pressing him to charge what a thing was worth, he insisting some things could not be priced, and neither ever fully won, which was how both of them liked it. They built no house over any warm ground, not ever, though a man tried more than once to sell Almon a claim on a steaming quarter section, swearing he could heat a mansion off it for nothing. Almon always said the same thing and always meant it, that he had spent one night learning what warm ground was worth and the rest of his life learning what it cost, and he would keep his family on plain, cold, honest earth that a man could trust. They raised 2 children on that plain, cold ground. The elder took to figures and went east in time to a bank, and Almon was proud and baffled in equal measure. The younger, a girl, took to the workbench and the splicing and the teaching as though born to it, and by the time she was 12, she could set a Ventsley better than her father and tell a freezing man from a merely cold one across a room. And Almon would watch her drill a customer the way her mother drilled them and have to turn back to his work so no one would see his face. Above the shop desk, where he could see it from the bench, hung Merritt Gage's caged lamp. The word safe scratched away and warning cut beneath it, and under the lamp, in a small frame Mina had made, the torn half of a wage chit, gone brown and soft with age. The letter about Merritt came in the 3rd winter. It was written in another man's hand, a foreman down at Livingston, and folded inside it was an old creased diagram of a mine timber set, the kind of drawing a young timberman makes when he's learning his trade and keeps his whole life without knowing why. Gage's chest had finally taken him, the letter said, quiet, in his sleep, in the thicker air of the lower country he had gone to for exactly that mercy. He had left instructions that the diagram go to the boy and Gardner. There was no note with it. Gage had never been a man for notes, but Almon understood the drawing as clearly as if the old man had spoken. It was the thing Merritt had known before he knew anything else, the timbering that held the roof up so the men beneath could work and breathe. And he had sent it to the one person who would understand that everything after all, the vents, the rules, the reading of the ground, had only ever been the same lesson in a colder country. Hold the roof up. Keep the air moving. Get the man out alive. Almon pinned the diagram beside the lamp, and he stood a while in the empty shop with the snow ticking against the window, and he let himself feel the whole weight of it at last. The hand on his chest, in the storm, the crossed-out word, the wagon thinning down the Livingston road. Then he wiped his face and went back to the bench, because there was a freighter's canvas to mend, and the man would be out on the road in it in a week, and that was the only thanks Merritt Gage had ever wanted from anyone. The years after came the way years come to a working man, in seasons and small milestones rather than great events. The shop grew and then held steady. The road shelters were rebuilt in better timber, and then, in time, needed less, as the wagon traffic that had once ruled that country began to thin. Once, when his daughter was near grown and asking the questions the young ask, Almon took her up into the park to the fenced and posted cavity where the whole of it had begun. He was gray by then and slow on his frost-stiff feet, and the girl steadied him over the crust the way he had once steadied himself with a lodgepole pole. They stood at the fence and looked at the dark mouth breathing its faint warmth into the cold, and she asked him whether he was not proud, at least a little, of the place that had made his name and saved 7 lives. "I'm afraid of it," Almon said. "The same as the first night. That is the only thing that ever kept me alive around it." He put his hand on the fence rail. "Every man who died in a hole like this one died because at some moment he stopped being afraid and started being comfortable. Your grandfather taught me that underground before you were thought of. Merritt taught it to me again up here. The heat down there is real, and it is worth having, and it will kill you the instant you trust it more than you watch it." He looked at his daughter. "If you remember one thing I ever tell you, remember that a warm place you cannot leave is worse than a cold one you can. That is the whole of my trade. Everything else is rope and canvas." They stood a while longer in the cold. Steam rose off the fenced ground and off the two old people looking at it, the same as it had risen off 7 living faces in a January dawn. And then Almond touched his daughter's arm, and they turned and went carefully back down to the road. Almond walked with a limp all his later life, from the frost that had gotten into his feet the night he went out on the rope for Sloane's convoy. And he never once complained of it, because every step it cost him was a step 7 people had lived to take. He grew old in Gardner with Mina beside him, and he watched the thing he had feared and fought his whole life slowly cease to matter. Not because men grew wiser, but because the country changed under them. He lived long enough to see the first automobiles come coughing up the Gardner Road and into the park, machines that crossed in an afternoon the distance that had nearly killed him in a day, that carried their own warmth and their own speed and did not need a warm hole or a low hut or a red pole standing above the snow. He lived in the end into a time that had forgotten why any of it had ever been necessary. That was the strange gift of a long life spent keeping people alive. If you did it well enough, the world forgot the danger had been real. He did not mind being forgotten. He minded only being wrong, and he had made a life out of not being wrong about the one thing that had tried to kill him. Immediate legacy. The 5 rules in Merritt Gage's hand were carried farther than Almond Vale ever traveled. In his working life, they hung in more than a dozen shelters along the northern roads, and Mina's short list of what to do with wet wool and how to know a freezing man was copied, word for word, into the front leaves of the freight company's supply ledgers, so that men who never heard his name learned to keep their dry clothes from their wet and to pitch a canvas rather than hang it flat. The original warm cavity was closed to all unsupervised entry once its heat and its air began to change. The structure did not last. The knowledge outlived it, the only monument Almond had ever wanted. Protagonists, fate. Almond lived out his life in Gardner, on plain cold ground outside the park, and never claimed a single foot of the country that had nearly buried him. He walked with a limp from the frost of the rescue and counted it a fair price. Merritt's lamp hung above his desk to the end, warning cut into the leather, and beneath it the torn wage chit in its little frame kept not for the 6 days' pay it had never been worth, but because it marked the hour when every ordinary shelter, every wage, every man with authority over him had thrown him into the snow to die. He died in Gardner in the 1930s, an old man in a country full of automobiles, having outlived the danger he had mastered. Echo close. Go back, one last time, to the road below Swan Lake Flat, to the late October afternoon when the wagon thinned into the falling snow and did not come back. A boy stood in the ruts with a wet blanket, 2 hard biscuits, and 38 cents. No horse, and no fire, and no one within calling distance to answer. And a sergeant had told him 2 mornings before the thing everyone in that country believed. A warm hole in Yellowstone is not a house, son. It is a grave with steam in it. The sergeant was not entirely wrong. The hole could have poisoned him, could have flooded with scalding water. Years later, when its air went bad, Almond himself was the first man to order it sealed. What saved him that January, when the storm dropped to 45 below and killed the mules and buried the tent, was never simply the heat. It was the mine lesson that made him leave the warmest corner. It was the intake he would not close, Mina's pitched canvas, Merritt's high flue, the rope leading back out into the white. Long after the shelter was gone, snow still gathered against a red vent pole beside his gardener's shop, and behind the window Merritt's lamp hung unlit above the torn wage chit. The ground had given Almond warmth, but the life he built came from knowing when not to trust it.